From tariffs and trade uncertainty to an ascendant China, war in the Middle East and Europe, and growing uncertainty about the future of American leadership, Canada is having to rethink some of its oldest assumptions about its place in the world and its relationship with its neighbor and closest ally. Few people have been closer to the seismic shifts playing out internationally than Jake Sullivan, who served as National Security Advisor to former U.S. President Joe Biden. Jake Sullivan is in Ottawa today for the annual CanSec Defense and Security Trade Show, and he's been kind enough to make time for us. Jake Sullivan, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So you've argued that the post-Cold War era is definitively over. Prime Minister Mark Carney has described this moment in similarly stark terms, not as a transition, but as a rupture in the world order, as he calls it. There has been some debate in this country about whether he is overstating the degree to which Canada's relationship with the United States has changed. Do you think he has the diagnosis and the prescription right, or is Canada at risk of maybe overcorrecting for what might still prove to be a temporary political cycle in Washington?
Well, I do believe that the Prime Minister is right that the international order is undergoing a fundamental shift. And that, as I have said, that the post-Cold War era is behind us and a competition is underway for what comes next. And what comes next will look quite different from what came before. So I think he is right about that. Where I would inject a note of caution, though, is that I think that the current friction between the U.S. and Canada is not fundamentally structural. It is about the current occupant of the Oval Office and his particular view on Canada, his particular way of engaging on questions of sovereignty and hurling insults and doing true social posts. And so, yes, I do think that there's room for the U.S.-Canada relationship to evolve, to grow, to change. But fundamentally, I believe in a deep and enduring partnership between our two countries because I think there is no other alternative for the national interest of both of us.
Mm-hmm. But many allies, not just Canada, are now building resilience, not just towards their traditional rivals, but also against volatility from Washington. It does seem that American unpredictability has maybe become a fact of geopolitics, something that now allies are actively hedging against. I know you've said that you think Canada and the U.S. are bound by this triple destiny through geography, our shared democracies, a shared technological future. But many Canadians are frankly rather worried about the state of American democracy today. Do you think Americans understand just how rattled its traditional allies are by this second Trump presidency?
I think some do, some probably don't have a full picture. I certainly have come to understand this quite deeply, traveling to places like Ottawa, traveling to Europe, traveling to our traditional treaty partners in Asia as well. So it's very clear that this has beyond rattled. I think it's shaken the foundations of these countries' view of the United States. And I get that. I understand why these questions are being asked. I guess I would make 2 points. The first is, Canada diversifying its relationships, increasing its own native capabilities in defense and technology, building closer ties to Europe and Asia and other countries. I think that's good, not just for Canada. It's good for the U.S.-Canada partnership as well, for our partnership to be embedded in this broader network of relationships. And second, my view is that at the end of the day, Democrats and Republicans, elected officials and private citizens almost across the board have a fundamentally positive view of the U.S.-Canada relationship and want it to succeed. I think that the outlier is the current president. And so while we're not going to go back to how things were before, I do think there is a degree of overstating the extent to which the relationship is so deeply broken it cannot be retrieved. I don't think that's inevitable, and I want to fight for it because I think it's in our interest to do so.
There still is a strong sense in Canada that even after Trump, things might not go back to anything like they were before. And I think you're saying that the relationship will have to, evolve. But there is this sense that that trust that previously existed just can't be restored by a change in administration, even a Democratic one. Do you think that's right? And if you think the relationship does need to evolve, how do you see it evolving? Concretely, what would that look like?
It's an interesting thing about trust. Trust can be eroded, degraded, even destroyed very rapidly. And it can only be rebuilt and cultivated more slowly. So I don't think the day a new president walks into office, he or she can snap their fingers and just say, okay, everything's back, everything's good. No, I don't believe that's viable. It's going to require hard work together and an agenda that is about delivering practical solutions that we both share. For example, we have to defend our continental perimeter against evolving threats from the Arctic, from long-range drones, from missile proliferation. We've got to do that. We've got to find a way forward that does that. For example, we have to deal with the fact that China is engaged in massive industrial overcapacity and that its sheer scale threatens to undermine and hollow out the industrial bases of both Canada and the United States. We're going to have to figure out how to work together to reinforce and strengthen our industrial bases. These are just realities in my view. And so the question about building trust is one that has to come over time, but it particularly has to come not just through soothing words from a new president, but through actions and policy and follow through. And that's what I hope to see from the United States in the years ahead.
You mentioned China. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Ottawa this week, the first visit to Canada by a Chinese foreign minister in a decade. It follows Mr. Carney's trip to Beijing earlier this year and what appears to be a deliberate effort to thaw that relationship. How difficult do you think this balancing act is for Canada? How far can this country expand or deepen its engagement with China while still seeking to remain more fundamentally aligned with the United States?
You know, I think that we had a pretty good formula going on this during the Biden administration, and it is a formula that I believe, for all the toing and froing in American politics, will ultimately stand the test of time, and that is the concept of de-risking, not decoupling. Canada has and should have an economic relationship with China, just like the United States does. That's totally natural. So I don't believe in decoupling our economies, but de-risking, that is, making sure that we are taking account of the national security threats of, for example, Chinese telecoms or Chinese software in Canadian critical infrastructure, and making sure that we are guarding against the risk of supply chain coercion where China could cut off Canada or the U.S. from vital inputs to our economy or squeeze in other ways. This, I think, is something that we are going to have to do, and so too is Europe, and so too are our friends in Korea, Japan, and other countries in Asia. So de-risking, not decoupling, for me is the order of the day.
I just want to step back a little bit again and talk about how Canada is trying to successfully navigate this new reality. Mr. Carney argued in his speech in Davos that middle powers are not powerless in this new era of great power rivalry, that they need to band together. And he argues that they can still shape outcomes by cobbling together these coalitions issue by issue. I wonder whether you buy that argument. Do you think middle powers have more room to maneuver in this environment or less?
I think middle powers have quite a bit of leverage and quite a bit of capacity. And you're seeing that in the way that Canada is extending its innovation and industrial partnerships with other countries, whether it's India or it's new trade arrangements in aluminum with the Netherlands. And, the list is pretty long. So I think there are opportunities here. But I would offer one word of caution, which is I do not accept the idea that it makes sense for democracies like Canada to equate the United States and China, to say basically they're the same and we need to deal with both of them similarly. I think the U.S. and China present incredibly different pictures for Canada. Whatever our current travails, at the end of the day, our geography, our democracy, our shared view of the future of technology, these bind us together. And I think it's important for Canada to see these distinctions between the U.S. and China and not paint them with the same brush.
And then just finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about Iran as well. Despite months of fighting, the regime has clearly shown its staying power, its ability to threaten the region, and of course, its willingness to choke off global energy flows in the Strait of Hormuz. When you look at where things stand now, and I understand obviously things are, obviously still in flux and it's unclear in which direction they're going to go, but how do you see this conflict ending?
Well, as someone who helped negotiate the original Iran nuclear deal back in 2015, then watched it get torn up and warned that that could eventually lead us into a misbegotten war, it has been sad for me to see this war play out. And I think it has put the United States and the world in a terrible position where Iran is holding the world hostage by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is holding the Gulf hostage by threatening civilian and energy infrastructure. And the United States is not capable of exerting its will to produce the outcomes it wants. It leaves me basically with the same conclusion that I've drawn for many years. The only way to deal with the threat Iran poses through its nuclear program is through a deal, a diplomatic deal. I hope that is what ends up happening in the coming days and weeks, but we never should have had to go through this war in the first place and all the costs it's imposed on everyone. We could have had that deal. We did have that deal, and President Trump pulled out of it, and we're all dealing with the consequences.
Jake Sullivan, former National Security Advisor to U.S. President Joe Biden. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks again very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.